Hello class and welcome back to MUS 222, the History and Sociology of Rock Music. Today we will be looking at Module 4 where we check out 1960s pop music. Now we've just moved out of the 1950s and we're going into a whole new era. As the 1950s came to an end, America was poised to enter a decade of very dramatic change that would become one of the most traumatic in its history. Rock was changing as well. A series of unrelated events that can only be chalked up to bad luck and bad timing caused the rebels of the first rock era to disappear from the scene. Elvis Presley moved on to the Army. Carl Perkins was in a terrible car accident. Little Richard went into the ministry. Jerry Lee Lewis had a marriage scandal. Chuck Berry's arrest. And Buddy Holly was killed in a plane crash. By the 1960s, major labels were busy packaging a more refined and less vulgar product to the maturing audience. By this time, many of the teens that had originally embraced rock and roll were becoming adults, entering the world of mortgages, jobs, marriage, and children. So they weren't so rebellious anymore. By the beginning of the 60s, the major labels were fighting back and began to regain control of the teen and young adult market by cultivating a new crop of singers who were clean-cut, wholesome, non-offensive, and white. The teen idols were groomed for stardom, not on the basis of their talent, but instead on their boy-next-door good looks. Frankie Avalon and Bobby Darin are some of the examples. Unlike most of the classic rock and rollers, the teen idols did not write their own songs, but instead recorded songs written by professional songwriters who would smooth out the rough edges of the earlier rock and roll. The typical teen idol song contained little or no beat, very lavish orchestration, and non-sexual, safe, romantic themes of idealistic teen love. All right, guys, pause here for a second. Hit Dream Lover by Bobby Darin and listen to the music. Okay, is it like the 1950s music that we were hearing from Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Muddy Waters and B.B. King? Listen to this and see the whole clean, wholesome type of music that was being produced by these teen idols. One reason for the huge success of the teen idols was their constant exposure on a TV program originally called Bandstand and hosted by Bob Horn, but taken over by Dick Clark in 1956 after Horn was arrested for drunk driving. In 1957, the show was picked up by ABC and renamed American Bandstand, and it aired until 1987. The format was very simple. Pack a TV studio with about 150 clean-cut teenagers who danced to the latest hit singles with weekly appearances by pop singers lip-singing along to their records. Clark had enormous power by picking which songs were played and how often, and also began building a music empire by investing in local record companies, publishing firms, a management company, and a pressing plant. The record labels also hit a very successful strategy by producing a series of novelty dance tunes, starting with the 1960s #1 hit, The Twist by Chubby Checker. The label followed up The Twist with other dance tunes, including The Hucklebuck, Pony Time, The Fly, and Limbo Rock. And they were all by Checker. And there were all other songs by other artists. The dance craze worked so well that The Twist returned to the #1 spot again in 1962. This is the only single since charting began in 1955 to top the charts twice. Usually instructions for the new dance were found somewhere in the lyrics of the song, and with exposure on American Bandstand, they quickly spread throughout the teenage nation. So think about that for today. What are some songs that you hear that are similar to these novelty dance tunes? Maybe you think about the Cha-Cha song, or the Macarena, or maybe even the Electric Slide. Other national TV programs like Arthur Godfrey, Jackie Gleason, Steve Allen, Milton Berle, and Ed Sullivan began presenting rock and roll as well in small doses. The Ed Sullivan Show was particularly important for artists to gain national visibility and were milestones in the early careers of Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. In New York, where the Tin Pan Alley composers had ruled pop music since the 1880s, a new breed of songwriters were beginning to emerge in the late 1950s. New songs had to be written with a rock beat and with storylines that related to teenagers, but that were not offensive to the adults. Many of the older, established songwriters were simply not up to the task, leaving the door open for a new crop of younger writers. By the early 1960s, this new pop songwriting scene was clustered in and around the Brill Building at 1619 Broadway, where over 150 music businesses were located. These songwriting shops became so influential to the industry that the pop music of the late 50s, early 60s became known as Brill Building pop. One of the most Aldon Music was founded in 1958 by songwriters Al Nevins and Don Kirshner. Nevins and Kirshner, who preferred their writers to work in pairs, assembled pop writing superstars. Working at Aldon Music was typical of the Brill Building scene. Each day, writers worked out song ideas in cubicles with upright pianos. Often, they would solicit suggestions and criticism from other company writers at the end of the day. The songs were then pitched to record companies who A&R men, arrangers, and producers would crank out the product. It was almost like an assembly line. By 1962, Aldon had 18 writers on staff who had placed hundreds of hits on the radio. An example of this would be Will You Love Me Tomorrow? And this was actually quite controversial for the time because it was addressing the problems felt by young women and the sexual double standard of the era. Take a second, pause here, listen to a little bit of Will You Love Me Tomorrow by the Shirelles, and then also click the link to listen to or to watch the Brill Building documentary. Phil Spector was a musical genius who created a legacy of one of the era's most important pop producers. Sensing that an all-female vocal group might succeed after years of male doo-wop groups, Spector began producing records for The Crystals, which consisted of 5 schoolgirls singing. The first 2 records were songs of innocent love and devotion of one's boyfriend, but their third release was banned due to controversial subject matter called He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss. The next 2 were smashes, He's a Rebel and Da Do Ron Ron. The success of Crystals was mirrored by other so-called girl groups with simple and predictable themes. While Spector was becoming a force in the success of the girls groups, he was also developing his famous wall of sound production technique to get the biggest sound possible on record. Spector combined large instrumental groups with multi-track overdubbing and liberal doses of reverberation from a giant echo chamber. First production was Da Do Ron Ron, which greatly influenced the industry and their innovative use of studio technology. After the British invasion killed off the girl groups, Spector turned his attention to the blue-eyed soul group Righteous Brothers, receiving success with You've Lost That Loving Feeling. But his career turned abruptly when his final and perhaps biggest wall of sound production, Ike and Tina Turner's River Deep Mountain High, flopped in 1965. Taken as a sign that the pop world was moving in a new direction, Spector sank into reclusiveness and paranoia. After years of reclusiveness, Spector made headlines in February of 2003 after the arrest for the murder of a 40-year-old starlight in the foyer of his California mansion, where he was found guilty and is now serving time in prison for 19 years. All right, so in the description box or underneath this video, I want you to watch the Wall of Sound video. Now, you're welcome to also hit the video for Da Do Ron Ron, but it is in the Wall of Sound video as well, so you can watch it there and get an idea of what the Wall of Sound is and how they put it together. A different type of pop music was developing on the West Coast during the 1960s. The sport of surfing spawned an entire subculture in Southern California that included carefree, laid-back lives, hot rods, wood-paneled station wagons, Hawaiian shirts and sandals, its own vernacular, and its own music. Surfing was brought to California from Hawaii and commercialized in Hollywood through a series of bikini beach party movies. The music of surf culture was driving, high energy, and primarily instrumental. It was dominated by the electric guitar. It had a raw garage band edge to it and was not overly produced. The first important surf band was Dick Dale and the Deltones. Dick Dale and the Deltones are a group that is considered to be the first surf band to have a surf hit in 1961 with the song Let's Go Trippin'. Pause here, take a second and listen to it. I want you to listen to the sounds so when I explain it, you kind of hear those. Dale often employed downward glissandos in his guitar playing to imitate the sound of waves. Dale worked closely with Leo Fender, the creator of the first solid body electric guitar, to develop the dual Showman amplifier, which had two 15-inch speakers and made it possible to play loud with distortion. It also employed a metal spring to create this reverb effect. Although Dick Dale was dubbed the king of the surf guitar, he became disillusioned with music after the surf boom died out and retired in 1965. A new fan base was developed after Miserlo was used in the 1994 film Pulp Fiction. Take a second, click on the link there and listen to the Pulp Fiction song. Other surf artists include the Marquettes, the Chantes, and the Safaras. And of course, who doesn't know the song Wipeout? Before surf music became popular, there were other instrumental rock hits by non-California bands in the late 1950s and early 60s that had a very similar sound but no connection to surfing. An example of this is going to be Tequila by the Champs. Although surf first appeared in instrumental music, ironically, the most famous of the surf groups was known for its beautiful vocal harmonies. Hailing from Huntington Beach, California, the Beach Boys consisted of three brothers. You had Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, and Carl Wilson. And then their cousin, Mike Love, and a family friend, Al Jardine. The Wilsons' father, Murray, was a frustrated part-time songwriter who was physically and emotionally abusive to his sons, often pushing them with beatings or humiliation. Murray built a music room in the garage, and the boys all learned to sing and play instruments at a very early age. In 1961, the boys, who called themselves the Pendletones, wrote and recorded Surfin' to try to cash in on the surf craze. The song became a regional hit and helped secure a contract with Capitol Records. They also changed their name at the suggestion of the local record distributor. Murray served as their manager. The Beach Boys' formula was actually quite simple. Combined the driving rock and guitar licks of Chuck Berry with the lush vocal harmonies. The subjects were about girls, cars, hanging out, and surfing. The primary songwriter was Brian, who also arranged the vocal harmonies and produced the records. Eventually, the emotional stress of writing hit songs, producing, arranging, singing, and touring became overwhelming, and in December of 1964, they made the decision to stop touring with the band. His heavy use of drugs made him very reclusive and mentally unstable. All right, pause here and listen to a little bit of Surfing USA from the Beach Boys. Now, one thing I want to make sure that you note is that surf music was actually known for not having any lyrics. However, the Beach Boys went against that, and they did have lyrics. So you may have some test questions about that, and so you need to know that the actual characteristics of surf music have no lyrics in them. All right. Now, they did manage to write a record album that contained only good songs and no fillers, as he set out to make the greatest rock and roll album ever with the album Pet Sounds. An array of unconventional instruments and sounds were used, including the timpani, Japanese percussion, harpsichord, glockenspiel, bass harmonica, and even barking dogs. So what we're going to do here is we're going to listen to these pieces, and I want you to identify the unique instruments that you hear. So let's listen to the first one, Sloop John B. So click the link in the description box below or below the video in Blackboard and listen to a little bit of it. Now there's actually going to be just the one instrument that we're listening for. It's going to be a high-pitched instrument, a little bit on the tingy side. So take a second and listen to that. Hit pause here so that way you don't actually see what's coming. And when you come back in, I'll let you know. All right, did you guess the song or the instrument? The instrument is actually the Glockenspiel, which is just a German word for bells. And if you're not familiar with the Glockenspiel, you can click on this Glockenspiel video that I have here and listen a little closer to what you can do with that Glockenspiel. But it is a keyboarded instrument that is very, very high pitched because of the metal and the tinging sound that it has. All right, let's check out the next one. All right, next song we have here is Wouldn't It Be Nice? So I want you to take a second, pause this video, and listen. There's actually going to be two instruments that you're going to hear that are unusual for the time. We sometimes hear these instruments, or at least one of them, in pop music, but it was very different than your regular rock and roll band. So take a second, pause, and see if you can hear two different instruments. All right, let's see what you got. At the very beginning, did you hear the harp being played? And then throughout the song, the accordion was also being played. Now, if you didn't hear those two instruments, I want you now to go back and listen to it again and see if you can hear the harp and the accordion. I know the accordion is probably harder to pick out, but it's definitely there, and if you're listening for it, you'll have no problem hearing it. All right, let's look at one more song. Let's look at Good Vibrations. Now, you're definitely going to hear a sound that is unlike any that you've heard before. And so I want you to hit pause here and click on the Good Vibrations video link and have a listen to it and try to figure out what that really unique sound is. All right. Could you figure it out? It was the electrotheremin or the tannerin. Now don't worry about writing all this down in your notes. I'm not going to actually quiz you on it, but I wanted to give you some background to what this instrument is. So as you can see in the picture, it is a little different. It has that slide sound to it. It's used in other things like Lost in Space, My Favorite Martian, obviously in Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations. So you can see there that there's lots of songs and videos and movies and radio that it has been used in. The Beach Boys could never quite escape their clean-cut and wholesome image, and their popularity began to fall. During the 70s and the 80s, the Wilson brothers were involved in too many drugs, too much partying, and too much self-indulgence. Drummer Dennis Wilson became friends with aspiring songwriter Charles Manson. Yes, Charles Manson, the murderer, yes, that's who we're talking about. He was friends with him for several months in 1968, but broke off the friendship just weeks before the brutal murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others in 1969. Dennis drowned in a boating accident in 1983, and Carl died of cancer in 1998. After years of mental and physical problems in the 70s and 80s, Brian returned to recording and touring, while Al Jardine and Mike Love established their own solo careers.